The global decline of freshwater mussels is a complex and time-consuming problem to tackle. The more hands we have on deck to deal with species listings, toxicology testing, propagation technology, population monitoring, and taxonomic uncertainties is better. However, increasing the number of hands on deck means training more people in the basics of freshwater mussel conservation. In this presentation, I will share the extreme Cliff Notes version of my 5-step training design process that I've used over the last 11 years at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. Now, when you're preparing to give a presentation, say at a scientific meeting or developing an outreach event for the public, I'm sure many of you have heard the phrase, know your audience. It may be the first thing, in fact, that pops into your head. I mean, who am I giving this presentation to? And what can I say that will catch their attention? Entire books have been written about this topic, and a simple internet search reveals literally hundreds of blog entries. Knowing your audience is also really important in the development of training, but it is not step one in my Extreme Cliff Notes 5-step process. Step number one of my process starts with clearly identifying the skills that are needed for a particular task. In other words, what does this person that I'm training do? Maybe they're a brand new technician at a propagation facility, or a seasoned endangered species biologist that has only recently started working with freshwater mussels, and they need to be able to get the job done. Not what do they need to know, but what do they need to be able to do? You might be saying at this point, okay, wait just a minute. How can they do something if they don't know anything? Well, that's an excellent point, but don't worry. We'll address what they need to know later in the presentation. For now, let's get back to what do they need to be able to do? Well, let's say you're hiring a new seasonal employee to help with surveys for the brook floater, Elasmodonna varicosa. The brook floater is being considered for ESA listing, and it's critical that this new seasonal employee can tell the difference between, say, brook floaters and the triangle floater, two species that co-occur in the same survey area. That's what they need to be able to do, accurately identify brook floater in the field. The second step in my Extreme Cliff Notes 5-step process is to develop a skill check. A skill check is a test of sorts that helps the trainer evaluate if the participant is capable of doing the job when the training session is complete. Now, this is not a test in the traditional multiple choice format, but it's really an opportunity for the trainee to physically demonstrate proficiency in the skill. Now, in the case of our summer technician working on brook floater surveys, this might be picking through a box of 100 shells of 10 different species and correctly separating out all the brook floaters from all the other species in the box. Now, this skill check could also be completed in the field. In other words, each time the technician finds a mussel during a survey, an experienced mussel biologist confirms their IDs until they're confident they can accurately identify brook floaters. Now, as with any skill, we all need some time to practice before the test, right? So the third step in my Extreme Cliff Notes 5-step process is to develop a skill practice exercise that provides participants a chance to practice the skill before being evaluated on the skill check. In many cases, the skill practice can be very similar to the skill check. A summer technician, for example, might practice by sorting boxes of shells or asking experts to verify their identifications in the field. But the key aspect of the skill practice is to provide continuous feedback from the expert. Feedback that will enable our summer technician to continuously fine-tune the skill until they're really comfortable demonstrating proficiency. It's only after the skill check, and skill practice have been identified that you should proceed to step 4 in the process, designing the content of the training session. Now, when I say content here, I'm talking about all those moments in the training when the student is listening instead of doing. This could be instructors providing short lectures or demonstrating the skill before the students get a chance to practice. But either way, the content should be centered around the skill that was identified in step number 1. In the end, the course content should be designed so that it closes the gap between where participants are in their skill level and where we need them to be. Now, remember the discussion in the beginning about knowing your audience. This is the step where knowing something about your audience comes into play. This gap between where the participants are in their skill level and where they need to be will be much larger for a summer technician that has, for example, never seen a mussel before in their life than a technician that has some previous experience with mussel surveys. In turn, the content needed to close those two gaps is going to be significantly different, right? If there is no gap in the end, then instruction on that skill is not really needed. Now, regardless of where students are, the number one rule in designing training, in my opinion, is there is always more content than there is time to teach it. I'm going to say that again. There is always more content than there is time to teach it. As experts, the people that lead training have a tendency to think that all content is important. The person, in their opinion, needs to know everything about the subject to be effective. Unfortunately, throwing everything at a student can be really overwhelming, and oftentimes the most critical content that you want to get across gets lost in the shuffle. So, the key to step number 4, and the most difficult step in this entire training design process, in my opinion, is selecting some content in and other content out. Deciding which content is the absolute most essential can be difficult and a time-consuming process, but the only content that should be selected in is content that is essential for practicing the skill and completing the skill check. We call this content need to know. All of the other content is still really important, but it's not essential for practicing and becoming proficient at the skill. Now let's go back to our summer technician for a moment to provide another example. Remember, they've been tasked with correctly identifying brook floater and being able to differentiate that species from other lookalikes. They need to know information about the key characters that separate this species from the others, maybe shell shape, shell sculpture, shell color, foot color, etc. Now, the life history of freshwater mussels is arguably one of the most interesting topics in the natural world. However, knowing that the brook floater is a short-term brooder and uses sculpin as a host to complete their life cycle is not essential for completing the skill check in this particular case. We would consider that information nice to know and would supply that information as supplemental reading material, but not include it in the training lecture or skill demonstrations. If the skill was propagation of brook floaters, then this information absolutely becomes need to know. Now, those examples may seem kind of obvious, but selecting some content in and some content out is oftentimes very subtle and more in kind of the gray area. But it's really important to make those decisions to ensure that the key points are not lost in the shuffle. The final step in the Extreme Cliff Notes process is to combine the content, skill practices, and skill checks into training modules. Modules can vary in length, but course content, again, lectures and demonstrations, should take up a very small percentage of the allotted time. The majority of the time should be spent doing something, either practicing the skill or demonstrating proficiency in the skill check. Now, the graphic on the screen shows an example floor plan for a generic 60-minute training module. Notice that the content, the need to know information, only takes up about 15 to 20 minutes of that allotted time. The remaining 40 to 45 minutes is spent doing, either practicing the skill, getting feedback from the expert, or completing the skill check. This format achieves a couple of goals. First, the trainee is given plenty of time to get their hands dirty and practice the skill hands-on. Secondly, the students are actively participating in the learning instead of passively listening. And research shows that active, hands-on training holds the learner's attention for a longer time and leads to greater retention of the material over time. So, now you have a short module for one skill. If your summer technician needs other skills, then simply repeat this 5-step process above for all the skills that are needed to get the job done. In the end, your summer technician will become independent and self-sufficient quicker, and you can take a step back from training mode and return to focusing all of your time on being a member of the survey team.